There are lives in history that seem to have been written by a playwright with a taste for grand tragedy. They are not the sun-drenched epics of celebrated heroes or the romantic ballads of fairy tale princesses. Instead, they are the darker, more complex narratives that unfold in the wings, just beyond the glare of the main stage lights. These are the stories of the ambitious, the overlooked, the figures who dared to reach for a destiny that was not theirs to have, and in doing so, revealed the fragile, often brutal human realities that lie beneath the polished veneer of power. We are drawn to these tales of intrigue and thwarted desire because they speak to a more unsettling truth, that within the same gilded families, under the shadow of the very same crowns, the lines between loyalty and betrayal, love and ambition can become terrifyingly, irrevocably blurred. Today we journey into one of modern royalty's most compelling and often whispered about shadow lives. It is the story of a woman born to be a princess who looked at the throne occupied by her own brother and believed she could claim it for herself. She was a figure of aristocratic bearing and formidable will, a master of palace intrigue who moved through the sun-kissed world of Monaco, not as a passive ornament, but as a calculating and determined player in a high-stakes game of power. Her life was not a singular dramatic downfall, but a meticulous, years-long campaign of ambition that culminated in a quiet yet absolute defeat. She was Princess Antoinette of Monaco, a woman whose story is a Shakespearean drama of sibling rivalry, a cold-blooded plot to seize a crown, and the long, slow exile that follows when such audacious plans turn to dust. Join us as we pull back the curtain on the carefully constructed myth of Monaco to uncover the intensely driven, deeply controversial, and ultimately poignant life of Antoinette, the princess who gambled everything against her own family and lost. To understand the formidable and calculating woman Princess Antoinette would become, we must first step into the fractured and emotionally turbulent world that forged her. Her story begins not in the sun-drenched idyll that Monaco would later represent, but in the cool aristocratic drawing rooms of Paris on the 28th of December, 1920. She was born Antoinette Louise Albert Suzanne Grimaldi, the first child of a dynastic marriage that was, by all accounts, a catastrophic failure from its very inception. This was not a union of love, but a cold, calculated arrangement designed to secure the future of a fragile dynasty. And the bitterness of that transaction would seep into the foundations of the next generation, poisoning the well from which her own life would be drawn. Her mother was Princess Charlotte, Duchess of Valentinois, herself a product of a desperate dynastic maneuver, the illegitimate daughter of Prince Louis II of Monaco and a French cabaret singer. Charlotte had been formally adopted and legitimized to prevent the throne from passing to a German cousin, a prospect that was unthinkable to France in the wake of World War I. This very act, this rewriting of the rules to suit the needs of the state, established a powerful precedent within the family. Succession was not an immutable sacred law, but a political tool that could be shaped by will and circumstance. It was a lesson her daughter Antoinette would internalize with profound consequences, seeing not a fixed reality, but a game whose rules could be bent by a sufficiently determined player. Antoinette's father was Count Pierre de Polignac, a handsome and cultured French aristocrat who upon marriage was made a Prince of Monaco. The union was a disaster. Prince Pierre, a man of aesthetic tastes and rumored homosexual inclinations, was a sensitive patron of the arts, a champion of figures like Diaghilev and the ballet russes. He was a man who thrived on beauty and creativity, yet he found himself trapped in a rigid, militaristic court run by his stern father-in-law, a man who valued soldiers far more than artists. He chafed under the domineering influence of Prince Louis II and found himself shackled to a woman with whom he shared no emotional connection. The couple's incompatibility became a subject of open gossip, their public appearances a masterclass in icy formality. Behind the palace walls, their private life was a battleground of biting remarks and profound resentment. They were two strangers bound together by a crown, and their home was not a nurturing cradle but a cold political theater, where the vast ornate rooms echoed with chilly silence, and every family dinner was thick with unspoken tension. Into this deeply dysfunctional environment, Antoinette was born, followed 3 years later by her younger brother, Rainier. Their childhood was not one of warm, familial affection, but a brutal education in emotional distance and palace intrigue. Raised by a string of governesses and tutors, their days were dictated by a rigid protocol that valued appearances above all else. They learned to navigate the emotional minefield of their parents' animosity, becoming adept at reading the subtle cues of displeasure, the tightened jaw, or the averted gaze that signaled another brewing storm. They witnessed firsthand the slow public unraveling of the marriage, which culminated in a scandalous and very public separation in 1930, followed by a formal divorce. This experience carved the two siblings in opposing directions, like a river splitting around a rock. Rainier, the younger boy destined for the throne, retreated inward. He developed the quiet, cautious, and deeply serious demeanor that would define him for the rest of his life. He found solace in solitary pursuits, stamp collecting, building models, working with his hands, hobbies that offered a sense of order and control that was entirely absent in his family life. He learned early to be self-reliant, to mask his emotions behind a stoic facade, and to view his royal duty as a solemn, almost burdensome weight. Antoinette, on the other hand, developed a harder, more assertive shell. She turned outward, becoming a keen and critical observer of the world around her. As the elder child, she was naturally more outspoken, more forceful in her personality. But this innate strength was sharpened into a weapon by the central, defining injustice of her youth. Despite being the firstborn, she was not the heir. The succession laws of Monaco, like most of Europe, adhered to male preference primogeniture. The crown was destined for her younger brother, simply because he was a boy. For a fiercely intelligent and strong-willed girl like Antoinette, this was more than just a rule. It was a daily invalidation. Growing up in a house where the laws had been famously bent for her own mother, the hypocrisy must have been galling. The rules, it seemed, could be rewritten to install a woman on the steps of the throne, but not to allow one to inherit it in her own right. This sense of being unfairly sidelined, of being denied her birthright, became the foundational grievance of her life. It wasn't just about a title, it was about worth. She was, by law and tradition, deemed secondary. This public and permanent declaration of her lesser status was the fertile soil in which the seeds of her immense ambition would be planted, and from which a bitter rivalry with her own brother would inevitably grow. While Rainier was meticulously groomed for his future role as sovereign, receiving an education tailored for a ruler, Antoinette's path was far less defined. She was a princess, yes, with all the privileges that entailed, but her purpose was secondary, her role supportive rather than central. She was expected to make a good marriage, to be an asset to the family, but never to lead it. She watched as her brother was given the attention, the training, and the destiny that she, as the elder, may have felt she deserved. This dynamic created not just a sibling rivalry, but a deep structural imbalance in their relationship. He was the future. She was the accessory. This frustration, combined with the emotional coolness of her upbringing, forged a woman who was fiercely independent, deeply proud, and possessed of a simmering resentment that was looking for an outlet. She learned to be strategic, to observe the power dynamics of the court with a cynical eye, and to wait for an opportunity. She was not just waiting for her moment. She was learning how to create one, how to claim the influence and validation she felt she had been so unjustly denied from the very moment of her brother's birth. The stage was being set not for a happy family saga, but for a dynastic power struggle that would pit sister against brother in a quiet yet ruthless war for control of the principality itself. The Second World War cast its long shadow over the siblings' adolescence, a period not just of uncertainty, but of profound national humiliation and fear. Monaco's official neutrality proved to be a fragile shield. The principality was occupied first by Italian forces, and then more ominously by the Germans. For the teenage Rainier and Antoinette, this was a stark, formative lesson in the brutal realities of power. They witnessed their home transformed, their sovereignty a polite fiction, their future hanging by the thinnest of threads. This experience of vulnerability, of seeing their fairy tale principality brought to its knees, would instill in both of them a fierce, almost obsessive desire to see Monaco secure and strong, though they would come to have catastrophically different ideas about how to achieve it. When the dust finally settled on a shattered Europe, a new era began. In 1949, their grandfather, the old soldier Prince Louis II, passed away. Their mother, Princess Charlotte, a woman who possessed a famously free spirit and little appetite for the rigid constraints of royal life, had long since renounced her own rights to the throne in favor of her son. Thus, at the age of just 26, the quiet and serious Rainier became His Serene Highness Prince Rainier III. He was now the absolute ruler of a principality that was in desperate need of revitalization. The Monaco he inherited was a faded jewel, a beautiful relic of a bygone age. The glamour of the Belle Epoque was a distant sepia-toned memory. The grand hotels that lined the seafront had an air of genteel decay, and its world-famous casino, the engine of the nation's economy, was struggling, its gilded rooms often eerily empty. The principality had a reputation for being staid, a sunny place for shady people, as the saying went. Rainier, a young, inexperienced, and most critically, unmarried sovereign, was handed a tarnished crown. The entire future of the Grimaldi dynasty, which had clung to its rocky perch for nearly 700 years, now rested on his solitary shoulders. The pressure to marry and produce a male heir was immense and immediate. It came from anxious ministers in the palace, from the powerful, ever-watchful government of France, and from his own people. It was not just a personal matter, it was a matter of national security and economic survival. With no heir apparent, Monaco was dangerously fragile, a ship without a rudder, drifting towards an uncertain future. And into this vacuum of uncertainty, this perfect storm of political pressure and dynastic anxiety, stepped Princess Antoinette. She was no longer a resentful young girl, but a formidable woman in her late 20s, radiating a confidence and assertiveness that stood in stark contrast to her brother's cautious solemnity. And she saw in her brother's bachelorhood not a problem for the nation, but a golden, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for herself. In the years after the war, while Rainier was burdened by his looming responsibilities, Antoinette had cultivated a life that was both unconventional and, in retrospect, deeply strategic. She had fallen in love with a celebrated Monegasque tennis champion, Alexandre Athénaz noblesse. Their passionate public relationship defied the staunchly Catholic and traditional conventions of the court, a defiance that reached its peak when Antoinette gave birth to 3 children with noblesse before they were eventually married: Elizabeth Anne in 1947, Christian in 1949, and Christine in 1951. On the surface, this could be seen as a rebellious princess choosing love over duty, a modern woman living life on her own terms. But the timing was far too precise to be mere coincidence. Her son, Christian de Massy, was born in the very same year her brother ascended the throne. With this single act, Antoinette had created what she saw as a crucial asset: an alternative male heir. While Rainier, the sovereign prince, remained childless, she, his elder sister, had provided a healthy male descendant of the Grimaldi line. She was building her own rival branch of the family, a line of succession ready and waiting in the wings. Her eventual marriage to noblesse in 1951, which retroactively legitimized their children in the eyes of the church and the law, felt less like a romantic conclusion and more like the final piece in a carefully constructed political strategy. She now had a legitimate son who could, in theory, inherit the throne, a living, breathing solution to the problem she was about to amplify. Antoinette was not acting alone in this audacious gambit. She had found a powerful and like-minded partner in her lover, Jean-Charles Ray. Ray was not merely a handsome lawyer. He was a major figure in Monegasque society, a political insider who served as the president of Monaco's National Council. He was ambitious, charming, persuasive, and deeply intertwined with the levers of power within the principality. Their relationship was a potent fusion of personal passion and cold political calculation. He saw in Antoinette a royal key that could unlock the highest levels of power, and she saw in him a brilliant strategist who could help her navigate the treacherous path to the throne. Together they looked at the young, dutiful, and still unmarried Prince Rainier, and saw a window of opportunity that was too tempting to ignore. They likely viewed his careful, deliberate style of governance not as prudence, but as weakness and indecision. They convinced themselves that they were the dynamic, modern alternative Monaco needed to shake off its lethargy. They believed he was failing in his most fundamental role, and that it was their duty and their right to step in. In clandestine meetings over cocktails on sun-drenched terraces, in shared glances across crowded rooms, the plan they began to hatch was breathtaking in its audacity. It was to be a quiet palace coup, designed not with weapons and soldiers, but with the far more insidious tools of whispers, lies, and the systematic destruction of an innocent woman's reputation. What unfolded in the early 1950s was one of the most intimate and insidious attempts at a coup in modern royal history. It was a psychological war waged not on a battlefield but in the most elegant of settings: the sun-drenched salons, the exclusive back rooms of the Monte Carlo Club, and the gossip-hungry press of the French Riviera. The target was not Prince Rainier directly, at least not at first. The initial strike was aimed at the woman who held his heart, the person who represented his private happiness and his hope for the future, the beautiful French film actress Gisèle Pascal. For 6 long years, she and Rainier had shared a deep and genuine love. She was not some fleeting fancy. She was his devoted companion, his confidant, a constant warm presence at his side, who shared his love for animals and his quiet, introspective nature. It was widely and happily assumed that she would one day become his wife, the Princess of Monaco. For Antoinette and Jean-Charles Ray, Gisèle was therefore the single greatest obstacle to their grand design. She was the human wall standing between them and the throne, and she had to be removed. Their strategy was as brilliant as it was cruel, a masterpiece of character assassination. They knew they could not openly challenge the prince's authority. That would be treason. So they chose to undermine him through the woman he loved, attacking the very foundation of his personal life. They began to secretly, systematically, and relentlessly spread a devastating rumor, a lie crafted for maximum impact. They didn't claim she was unfaithful or unsuitable in character. They chose something far more insidious, something that sounded clinical, official, and tragically final. That a trusted doctor in a confidential examination had found Giselle Pascal to be infertile. In a deeply Catholic monarchy whose very survival depended on procreation, this was the ultimate poison dart. It was a rumor designed to be untraceable, a wisp of smoke passed in hushed, concerned tones at dinner parties. A word dropped to a chatty society columnist here, a sad secret shared with a foreign diplomat's wife there. It was allowed to fester in the glamorous, gossipy ecosystem of the Riviera until it hardened into accepted fact. The goal was twofold and devastatingly effective. First, and most obviously, it was meant to sever the relationship between Rainier and Giselle. The rumor would create an impossible situation for the prince, backing him into a corner of dynastic duty. How could he, the sovereign responsible for the future of his nation, marry a woman, however beloved, who could not provide him with an heir? It would be portrayed as a catastrophic dereliction of his sacred duty, a betrayal of the Grimaldi legacy. The public pressure, combined with the private anguish, would, they calculated, eventually force him to end the relationship. Second, the rumor was designed to paint Rainier himself as a weak and ineffectual ruler. The narrative they spun was that of a lovelorn, romantic fool, a man incapable of making the hard, necessary choices for the good of the state. It questioned not just his judgment, but his very fitness to rule, suggesting he was putting his personal feelings before the survival of his country. Antoinette played her part to perfection, giving the performance of a lifetime. Publicly, she positioned herself as the loyal, concerned older sister, her face a mask of patriotic worry. She would speak to confidants and journalists about the pressing need for a Grimaldi heir, her words laced with a subtle but unmistakable implication that her dear brother was failing in his primary duty. She would sigh and express her deep sadness over Rainier's unfortunate dilemma, all while secretly fanning the flames of the crisis she herself had engineered. And the unspoken solution to this manufactured crisis was, of course, always present: her own healthy, charming son, Christian. He would be brought to public functions, a living, breathing symbol of dynastic continuity. He was the answer, the patriotic alternative to his uncle's romantic dead end. In this way, Antoinette framed her ambition not as a selfish power grab, but as a painful but necessary intervention to save the dynasty from her brother's folly. The pressure on Prince Rainier became immense, an emotional siege. His private life was no longer his own. It had been weaponized and turned into a matter of state security. The insidious whispers echoed in the halls of his own palace, spread by servants and courtiers with shifting allegiances. He was caught in an impossible trap, torn between his deep, abiding love for Giselle and the immense 700-year weight of his dynastic responsibility. Accounts from the time suggest a period of deep personal anguish for the young prince. He was profoundly isolated, betrayed not by a foreign enemy or a political rival, but by his own sister, his own flesh and blood, in the most public and humiliating way possible. Eventually, after months of this relentless psychological warfare, the campaign took its inevitable toll. In 1953, the love story that had survived for 6 years was finally broken. Rainier and Giselle Pascal ended their relationship. She left Monaco, a heartbroken woman whose reputation had been unfairly and permanently tarnished by vicious lies. She was a casualty of a dynastic war she never wanted to fight. In a final, bitter twist of irony that exposed the complete fabrication of the rumor, Giselle later married another man and gave birth to a healthy daughter, proving her fertility beyond any doubt. But by then, the damage was done. The truth came too late to save the love she and Rainier had shared. For a brief, triumphant moment, it seemed that Antoinette and Jean-Charles Ray had won a total victory. They had successfully removed the immediate obstacle. The prince was alone, grieving, and publicly weakened. The succession was once again an open and urgent question. Antoinette's influence was at its absolute peak. She now had allies in the government and the ear of her now isolated brother, who in his grief may have turned to her for counsel. Her son was being positioned as the heir in waiting, the future of the principality. She was closer than she had ever been to the throne, the de facto power behind it. Her meticulous, cold-blooded plan was on the very verge of complete success, but she had made a critical error in judgment, a fatal flaw born of arrogance. She had mistaken her brother's quiet nature for weakness and his sorrow for surrender. She had profoundly underestimated the resilience and determination of her quiet, wounded brother. Pushed into a corner by his sister's betrayal, his personal life in tatters, and his authority questioned, Prince Rainier knew he had to act decisively. The Whisper campaign had exposed his vulnerability and the fragility of his position. He needed more than just a wife. He needed a miracle. He needed a grand gesture, a move so spectacular and unexpected it would completely reset the narrative of his reign, silencing all questions about the future of his dynasty. His search for a bride became a mission of state, a high-stakes gambit advised by powerful figures like the Greek shipping magnate Aristotle Onassis, who famously suggested that marrying a Hollywood star would be the ultimate modernizing move, bringing American glamour and, more importantly, American investment to the struggling principality. And so Rainier's search led him famously to the shores of America and to a woman who was the living embodiment of elegance, beauty, and global stardom, Grace Kelly. Their meeting, their whirlwind courtship, and their magnificent wedding in April of 1956 were not merely a love story. They were a strategic masterstroke of geopolitical and public relations genius. In the staid ancient courts of Europe, where royals married other royals, the idea of a reigning sovereign marrying a working actress, a movie star, was nothing short of revolutionary. It was a sensational break with centuries of tradition that shocked the old guard, but captivated the rest of the world. It transformed Monaco overnight from a sleepy, slightly faded resort town into the absolute epicenter of global glamour. The wedding was dubbed the Wedding of the Century, a spectacular two-day affair broadcast to an estimated 30 million viewers around the world. Grace Kelly, arriving with 80 pieces of luggage and the adoration of a planet, brought with her a level of prestige, media attention, and international goodwill that money could never buy. The world was utterly enchanted. And in one fell swoop, Rainier had not only secured a bride, but had also rebranded and revitalized his entire country. For Princess Antoinette, watching this fairy tale unfold, it must have felt like a declaration of war. She was forced to attend the lavish ceremonies, to smile for the world's cameras, to play the part of the devoted sister while her life's ambition crumbled into dust before her very eyes. The arrival of Grace Kelly was a catastrophic, fatal blow. The new Princess of Monaco was not some pliable, naive European aristocrat whom she could intimidate or manipulate. Grace was a product of the notoriously tough Hollywood studio system of the 1950s. She had navigated contracts with iron-willed studio heads, held her own against legendary directors, and managed a global career under the relentless glare of the press. She was intelligent, poised, fiercely determined, and she understood power, how to get it, how to wield it, and how to defend it. She was also deeply in love with her husband and fiercely protective of her new role and the future she was determined to build with him. A silent, undeclared war for influence, a veritable Game of Thrones on the Riviera, began almost the moment Grace stepped foot in the palace. Accounts from courtiers and biographers from that period paint a picture of a palpable, chilling tension between the two women. Antoinette, the incumbent sister, the palace insider, knew every secret passage and hidden allegiance within the ancient walls. Grace, the glamorous outsider, now held the ultimate trump card, the prince's heart, and the title of her Serene Highness. It was a classic confrontation between the old guard and the new, a clash of cultures as much as personalities. Antoinette represented the old insular world of European court intrigue. Grace represented a new, media-savvy American form of soft power. With her quiet resolve and keen instincts, Grace quickly recognized Antoinette and her network of allies not just as a nuisance, but as a persistent threat to the stability of her husband's throne. She understood, with the clarity of a survivor, that for her own family to be secure, Antoinette's influence had to be neutralized, completely and permanently. With a methodical precision that was as effective as it was discreet, Princess Grace began to clean house. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public dismissals. Her approach was far more subtle. She started by asserting her own authority as the undisputed mistress of the palace, taking over domestic arrangements and overseeing the staff with a firm but fair hand. One oft-told story involves the redecoration of the private apartments. Antoinette had initially been placed in charge, a role she used to assert her own taste and maintain a foothold of control over her brother's home. Grace, recognizing the power play, politely but firmly took over the project herself, making it clear without a single raised voice that a new authority was now in command. She allegedly worked to identify members of the palace staff who were loyal to her sister-in-law, a certain secretary, a longtime cook, a maid with a loose tongue, and had them gradually and quietly replaced with people loyal to the new princely couple. She was dismantling Antoinette's power base not with a sledgehammer, but with a scalpel, brick by brick from the inside out. At the same time, she was winning the public relations war, charming the Monegasque people, diligently learning French and founding charities. She was building a fortress of public adoration that Antoinette, with her cold and haughty reputation, could never hope to breach. Any last desperate flicker of hope for Antoinette's plan was extinguished by the roar of cannons. On January 23, 1957, a 21-gun salute boomed across the harbor, the sound echoing off the ancient rock, announcing to the world that Princess Grace had given birth to a healthy baby girl, Princess Caroline. The succession was no longer a hypothetical question. A little over a year later, on March 14, 1958, the cannons roared again, this time with a thunderous 101-gun salute, the traditional announcement for the birth of a male heir, Prince Albert. Each boom was another nail in the coffin of Antoinette's ambitions, a public celebration for Monaco that was for her the sound of utter and final defeat. The game was over. Antoinette had not just been outmaneuvered, she had been rendered completely irrelevant. To be defeated is one thing, to be ignored is another. And for a woman as proud as Antoinette, it was a fate worse than exile. The births of Rainier and Grace's children slammed the door on her ambitions with a resounding, undeniable finality. Her son Christian was no longer a potential heir. He was now just another cousin, pushed far down the line of succession. The years of scheming, the cruel rumors, the betrayal of her brother, it had all come to nothing. She was no longer a powerful regent in waiting. She was now simply the prince's problematic older sister, a living, breathing reminder of a bitter family feud, best forgotten. The Hollywood queen had won, and in doing so, had secured the future of Monaco for generations to come. Of course, here is the fully developed and seamlessly integrated version of the chapter, The Long Retreat, Exile in Plain Sight, enhanced with new details, deeper psychological insight, and the specific storytelling voice you have requested. The defeat was absolute, and Antoinette's fall from the center of power was as swift as it was quiet. There was no public denunciation, no formal decree of banishment. Such overt drama was not the style of the Grimaldi court, where appearances were everything. Instead, she was subjected to a far more subtle and perhaps more psychologically punishing form of exile. It was a social death, a slow creeping erasure. Invitations to intimate family dinners stopped arriving. Phone calls from old allies and courtiers went unreturned. On the rare occasion she attended a national event, she was met with a polite but distinctly cool deference. She was systematically marginalized, her influence dismantled, her access to her brother carefully managed and restricted by a new impenetrable wall of staff loyal to the new princess. The vibrant life of the palace, now revolving entirely around Prince Rainier, his glamorous wife, and their beautiful young children, no longer had a place for her. The final quiet signal came when she was encouraged to leave her apartments within the palace walls. It was time for her to go. Antoinette retreated to her villa, Le Bout du Monde, the end of the world, in the stunning coastal town of Aix. The location was deeply symbolic, a piece of poetry written by a cruel hand. Perched high on a cliff, the villa offered breathtaking views of the Mediterranean, and on a clear day, she could see the distant rock of Monaco, a tiny, taunting silhouette on the horizon. She was close enough to witness the world she had lost, the glittering parties, the state visits, the life she believed should have been hers, but forever separated from it by an impassable gulf. Her home became her fortress, its walls shutting out a world that had rejected her. It was an exile in plain sight, a daily tormenting reminder of her failed ambitions, lived out as a local curiosity, the sad, forgotten princess whom tourists might occasionally glimpse, a remote and lonely figure walking her dogs against a backdrop of impossible beauty. Stripped of her political purpose, Antoinette was forced to reinvent herself. The grand strategic stage of Monaco was no longer hers to command. Instead, she turned her formidable energy and passion towards a cause that was entirely apolitical: the welfare of animals. She became the president of Monaco's Society for the Protection of Animals, SPA, and established a refuge for stray and abandoned dogs and cats. This was not a passive ceremonial role for a bored aristocrat. By all accounts, she poured her heart and soul into this work with a ferocious dedication. Her villa became a personal sanctuary for dozens of rescued animals, a chaotic, barking, purring kingdom where she was the undisputed and beloved monarch. Those who knew her during this period spoke of an almost fanatical devotion, a woman who found in the unconditional loyalty and simple affections of her animals a solace that the complex, treacherous world of human relationships had never provided. One can only speculate on the deep psychological shift this represented. Was this a genuine search for a new, more compassionate purpose? Almost certainly. But was it also a way to build a new kingdom, a small furry domain where she was the undisputed ruler, the beloved savior? It's hard to imagine otherwise. After a lifetime of being judged, betrayed, and sidelined, she had created a world where she was needed, adored, and entirely in control. Animals do not lie. They do not scheme for power. Their love is not conditional. For a woman whose life had been shattered by the ultimate betrayal, this honest, uncomplicated affection must have been a powerful balm. Her devotion to this cause became the defining feature of her public persona for the rest of her life, slowly and deliberately replacing the image of the political schemer with that of a reclusive, somewhat eccentric, but ultimately harmless animal lover. It was, in its own way, her final and most successful act of public relations. Her personal life, however, continued to be marked by complexity and a recurring tinge of tragedy. After her marriage to Alexandre Noges ended in divorce, she married her former co-conspirator, Jean-Charles Ray, in 1961. It was a fascinating and telling choice, one that baffled many. Why unite with the man who was your partner in your greatest ambition and your greatest failure long after the war was lost? Perhaps it was a pact of silence, a shared defiance against the world that had cast them both out. Or perhaps it was a desperate clinging to the only person on earth who truly understood the dizzying height of what she had reached for and the crushing depth of her fall. But this alliance, forged in the fires of a shared secret war, did not last, and they eventually divorced. Her third and final attempt at marital happiness was perhaps the most poignant. In 1983, at the age of 63, she married John Gilpin, a celebrated and handsome British ballet dancer. He was a vibrant artist, a man from a world far removed from the stifling protocols of Monaco. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed she might have found a measure of late-life peace and genuine companionship. But in a cruelly tragic twist of fate, just 6 weeks after their wedding, Gilpin died suddenly of a massive heart attack. This final, devastating loss was the ultimate blow, seeming to seal her retreat from the world for good. She had outlived her political hopes, her alliances, and now a final fleeting chance at personal happiness. As the years morphed into decades, Antoinette became an increasingly remote figure. The Monaco she watched from her cliffside villa transformed under her brothers and sister-in-law's reign into the global capital of finance and luxury she had perhaps envisioned, but could never control. She was a ghost at the feast of Monaco's success, a living memento mori of the bitter conflict that lay beneath the glittering surface of the official fairy tale. While rumors of her bitterness and reclusiveness occasionally surfaced, she maintained a dignified, if distant, silence, cloaking her pride in a wall of privacy. She had played the Game of Thrones and lost decisively. Now, all that was left was to live out the long, quiet remainder of her days, surrounded by her loyal animals, a princess in name, but an exile in her soul. Of course, here is the fully developed and seamlessly integrated version of the final chapter, the final curtain, A Ghost at the Feast, enhanced with new reflective content to provide a powerful and satisfying conclusion to the script, all while adhering to the established storytelling voice. The final decades of Princess Antoinette's life unfolded in a quiet, predictable rhythm, a long, slow exhale after the high drama of her youth and middle age. The world outside her villa in Aix continued to turn, bringing with it both joy and profound sorrow for the Grimaldi family she watched from a distance. The most shattering of these events was the tragic death of her sister-in-law, Princess Grace, in a car accident in 1982. This devastating loss plunged Monaco into a state of genuine, heartfelt mourning. and fundamentally altered the family Antoinette had once sought to control. One can only imagine the complex and turbulent emotions that must have passed through Antoinette upon hearing the news. There would have been no simple sense of triumph. Instead, perhaps, a quiet, chilling recognition of a shared, strange destiny. With the passing of her great rival, the central conflict that had defined her adult life was suddenly over. The dynamics within the family shifted once more. The old antagonisms, forged in the heat of their power struggle, began to lose their sharp edges, softened and eroded by the universal solvent of time and shared grief. As her brother, Prince Rainier, grew older, transforming from the embattled young prince into the venerable patriarchal figure of a prosperous nation, a quiet, unspoken truce seemed to settle between the two siblings. The fiery conflict of their youth mellowed into a more distant but peaceful coexistence. There were no grand apologies, no dramatic reconciliations. Their relationship was too scarred for that. The thaw was quieter, happening in small, almost imperceptible gestures, a brief shared glance of understanding at a family christening, an annual Christmas visit that became an unspoken tradition. Antoinette was seen more frequently, though still rarely, at major state and family events such as the grand celebrations for the 50th anniversary of her brother's reign in 1999, and later, at his funeral in 2005. Her presence at these somber family gatherings was a quiet acknowledgement of an unbreakable if deeply strained bond. She stood there, a formidable figure from another age, a living link to a past only she and her brother truly understood. They were the last two of their generation, the keepers of a shared, complicated history, bound together by a lifetime of secrets, resentments, and blood. Her final years were lived largely in seclusion, her formidable health gradually declining. On March 18, 2011, Princess Antoinette of Monaco, Baroness of Massy, died at the Princess Grace Hospital Center in Monaco. She was 90 years old. There is a profound and poignant irony in the fact that she drew her last breath in the institution named for the woman who had so comprehensively vanquished her. It was Grace's most visible and beloved legacy to her adopted homeland. For Antoinette's story to end, there feels like the final act of a Greek tragedy, a final, inescapable link between the two great female protagonists of Monaco's modern story. It was as if, in the end, she had to enter her rival's house to find her final peace. Her death was not a major international news event, but a quiet closing of a long and complex chapter. Her funeral was a family affair, attended by her own children and grandchildren, the de Massy clan, a lasting testament to the family line she had fought so hard to advance. And importantly, it was attended by her nephew, the reigning sovereign, Prince Albert II, and her niece, Princess Caroline. Their presence was the final public gesture of reconciliation. This was more than mere protocol. For the children whom their mother had so fiercely protected from their aunt's ambitions, their respectful attendance was a deliberate act of generational healing. It was a sign that the wounds of the past had, if not entirely healed, at least scarred over, allowing for a final acknowledgement of her place within the family she had both loved and challenged. The ceremony was a testament to a life of contradictions. She was mourned as a princess of Monaco, a member of the ruling house, yet she had spent more than half her life on its periphery, an outsider looking in. She was remembered for her passionate work for animal welfare, a legacy of compassion that stood in stark contrast to the cold calculation of her earlier political maneuvers. She was a mother and a grandmother, the head of her own prominent branch of the family. Yet she died without the ultimate power and influence she had once believed was her birthright. Her passing went largely unnoticed by the wider world, which had long since forgotten the bitter palace intrigues of the 1950s. The fairy tale of Rainier and Grace was simply a better story, more romantic, more inspiring, and far more profitable for the glittering image of Monaco. Antoinette's life was the uncomfortable family secret, the darker, more complex chapter that was quietly placed back on the shelf in favor of the more palatable narrative. But for those who study the intricate histories of royal houses, her death marked the end of an era. She was one of the last of a generation of royals who saw power not just as a duty, but as a prize to be fought for, a game to be won. She was a throwback to an older, more ruthless time, a world that has largely vanished, replaced by the modern royal focus on image, charity, and survival. So what is the final legacy of a woman like Princess Antoinette? She left behind no sweeping political reforms or celebrated cultural institutions. She will not be remembered as a beloved national icon or a dutiful consort. By all the conventional metrics of royal success, her life could be viewed as a story of failure, a long, slow descent from the heart of power into quiet obscurity. Her story is one of profound, relentless ambition that ultimately broke against the unyielding rock of her brother's duty and the global phenomenon that was Grace Kelly. But to dismiss her as a mere historical footnote, a simple villain in her sister-in-law's fairy tale, is to miss the deeper, more unsettling, and far more human truth of her existence. Antoinette's true legacy lies not in what she achieved, but in the uncomfortable questions her life forces us to ask about the nature of power, family, and the roles prescribed for women in history. She is a stark and powerful reminder that royal lives are not preordained narratives of destiny fulfilled. They are subject to the same raw human emotions that drive us all: jealousy, resentment, a desperate yearning for recognition, and a burning ambition to shape one's own fate. Her life was a tragic testament to the brutal reality that a crown can be as much a prison as a privilege, and that being born into a palace is no guarantee of happiness or contentment. She was, at her very core, a woman whose formidable, assertive personality was in direct and constant conflict with the secondary role assigned to her by the accident of her gender. In another era, or simply born a man, her drive and strategic mind might have been celebrated as leadership qualities. Instead, in the context of mid-20th century monarchy, her ambition was seen as transgressive, unnatural, and dangerous. Her story can be read as a cautionary tale about a strong woman who refused to gracefully accept her place in the shadows and used the only weapons available to her, intrigue and manipulation, to fight for a place in the sun. Furthermore, her actions had a profound and deeply ironic consequence that she could never have intended. It can be argued that Antoinette, in her very attempt to destabilize her brother's reign, was the unwitting catalyst for its greatest triumph. Was it not the threat she posed, the public questioning of his ability to secure the dynasty, that lit a fire under Prince Rainier and pushed him to make the most brilliant strategic move of his life: his marriage to Grace Kelly? That union did more than just produce heirs. It saved Monaco, ushering in an unprecedented era of prosperity and glamour. In a strange twist of fate, Antoinette's plot, by failing so spectacularly, may have inadvertently secured the very dynasty she was accused of trying to tear apart. The legacy of Princess Antoinette is therefore a complex and essential one. She is the shadow that gives the glittering story of modern Monaco its depth and dimension. She represents the inconvenient, messy reality that lurks behind every polished royal portrait. Her life reminds us that history is never a simple story of good versus evil, but a complex interplay of flawed human beings, each fighting for their own version of survival and significance. She was the forgotten princess, the schemer in the palace, the ghost at the magnificent feast of the Grimaldi revival. And in remembering her solitary, ambitious, and ultimately sorrowful life, we are reminded of a vital and compassionate lesson: to always look for the real person behind the public title, the fragile, striving heart behind the cold, aristocratic mask, and the silent, often painful, and deeply human story that is waiting to be told.